What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a speed test and performance comparison between three of Samsung's 2022 A-series smartphones: the A33 5G, the A53 5G, and the A73 5G. Now, the reason I wanted to do this test is because across the board, really, these are very similar devices in a lot of ways, but one thing that is supposed to differentiate them is the performance. And I want to sort of showcase in real time how much faster or maybe slower one device might be, whether it's with everyday Android apps, social media scrolling, web browsing, and especially gaming. And hopefully this helps you determine which device might work best for you based on your needs and what makes the most sense to spend your hard-earned money on, since there's obviously a decent price difference between these three phones as well. Before we jump into it, I do just want to take a second to go over the specs of each device so you know what we're working with, and then we'll start getting into the various side-by-side speed and performance tests that I have set up. So the lower end phone of this lineup, the A33 5G, has Samsung's own Exynos 1280 chipset inside, which is relatively new, and my device is spec'd with 6 gigs of RAM. Interestingly enough, the next phone up, the A53 5G, is also powered by the Exynos 1280, and mine also has 6 gigs of RAM inside. The highest end phone of the trio, and the only one with different internals, is the A73 5G. It has a Qualcomm Snapdragon 778G 5G chipset and 8 gigs of RAM. Now, to start off, here are the Geekbench scores, which you can use to compare not just the processing power of these three phones to one another, but perhaps against the device you currently have at home. It might help in determining if any one of these devices is better than your current one. And yes, while the A33 and A53 are technically supposed to have the same processor and RAM, they do display different scores here for whatever reason, though I don't consider those numbers to be significantly different. It's really the A73 that stands out, especially with its multi-core score being some 40% higher. Its processor seems to be measurably better, which is expected, but this sort of puts it in real terms. And just for transparency's sake, here are the breakdowns of some of the individual component scores as well as the RAM configurations, so you can confirm that what I mentioned earlier is accurate. So in prepping for this test, all three phones have been charged up to 100% battery, which by the way we'll also be testing as we go through. They've been set up in exactly the same way with just about the same apps installed. There are a couple random pre-installed Samsung apps that differ, but 95% of what's on each phone should be identical, and all the stuff inside each app has also been set up the same way too. They've all been updated to the latest versions of Android and One UI that they currently support. All the apps are updated as well via the Google Play Store and Galaxy Store, so I've tried to make the test as fair and as even and as accurate as possible, but if there's anything else I can do to even the playing field in a future speed test, be sure to let me know. Now, when it comes to just launching and loading some of the default Android apps and Samsung apps that you might utilize consistently throughout the day, I think you'll see that there really isn't going to be a noticeable difference here. If there is, it's a fraction of a second, and might have to do more with just my taps not quite being all at the same time. Nowadays, unless you're putting a super budget device like the A03 Core up against the A73, I just don't think you're going to experience like the Messages app or the Gallery app, for example, being surprisingly quick to open in comparison. Android and Samsung's One UI are also well optimized on pretty much all the devices that are $250 and above nowadays, and this is just not really where you're going to gain any advantage. This is where you can kind of determine what your smartphone usage looks like throughout the day and decide if it makes sense to just opt for the less expensive phone. When you consider a sub $300 price point on the A33 and a $500 or more price point on the A73, maybe you can come to the conclusion that you really only utilize your device for basic and mid-level tasks, and it just makes way more sense to save the money. You aren't missing anything after all, and you aren't really sacrificing anything performance related with this kind of usage. Yeah, you might see web pages load up a little faster on the A73, Google Maps might be a tiny bit quicker, jumping to the comment section on YouTube can be faster sometimes, but with that kind of stuff, where the day-to-day smartphone tasks aren't particularly taxing, I have a hard time justifying the price increase. And what's also important to remember here is that the A33 and A53, like I mentioned, have the exact same specs. There are other features on the phones that differentiate them, of course, but if speed and performance are your main concern, again, I don't see much of an advantage in the A53 over the A33. And objectively speaking, there probably shouldn't be anyway. So those are my thoughts on the basic stuff, at least. I just don't really see where another $100 or $200 yields you that much better performance performance. But let's now dive into where you'll actually experience a difference, and that's with the more complex, graphics-intense apps like games. Now, to start off, just launching and loading any given game, really, I think you'll start to see a measurable difference in load times right from the splash screen. Oftentimes, the A73 will get you to the start page 5 or 6 seconds before the other two phones. And as we start to progress here with more complicated games, that difference only grows more and more. Now, we're obviously not talking in terms of minutes. It's not like you're going to save 4 minutes of your life if you opt for the higher end phone. We aren't talking in those terms with these devices, but 6, 8, 10 seconds, sometimes up to 15 or 20 seconds even, that's significant enough for sure. Now, it's obviously not always that drastic, and in fact, a few times here, all three phones seem to be synced up pretty well with one another, but more often than not, with the more graphics heavy stuff, the A73 is going to get there first and be waiting at least a little bit for the other phones to catch up. Of course, launching the apps is one thing. Let's get into some in-game performance. Now, this is going to depend heavily on which games you're actually playing and what kind of graphic settings the developers offer you. For super simple games, it doesn't really matter what device you're playing on. They're going to play the same on the default settings, and you'll see next to no advantage or disadvantage one way or another. But with the games where you do have the option to bump up the graphics, the visuals, the frame rate, and whatever else, this is where you will start to see some in-game performance differences. So for example, in Apex Legends Mobile, with all three phones on the highest graphics and frame rate options that they support, you can see that the A73 can play at a consistent 60 frames per second, the A53 is stuck at about 40, and the A33 for some reason can't get past 30, and even drops below that at times. You might also be able to pick out some frame dropping and artifacting as I look around in game. Interestingly enough, all three phones are actually in the same squad in the same match, so you get to see the same scenery on all three, which is cool, and the A33, for whatever reason, continues to drop frames. The A73 delivers a smooth and consistent in-game experience, and here's another example, Car X Rally Racing. On the A73, it seems to be pushing close to 100 frames per second without dropping, though I'm not sure that's too accurate, while the A53 and the A33 tend to fluctuate between 30 and 60 frames per second for the most part. Now, a lot of people like to point out that gaming on smartphones isn't like gaming on a console or PC. You shouldn't always expect crazy high graphics settings or a ridiculously smooth experience, and mobile games are sort of made to be a bit simpler at times. But the point is, if you're looking for a difference between these three phones, if you're looking for a reason to opt for one phone over another, this is pretty much it right here. With graphics intense games at their highest settings, you're going to get a smoother, better experience that I think is noticeable, and that I think some people will value and find worth it with a higher tier phone like the A73. Is it an absolute deal breaker? I don't necessarily think so, and in fact, I found that all of these games still play mostly fine on the other two phones. In fact, at their mid-level default graphics settings, I thought all three phones played very similarly. But if you value the best in-game experience, you will get a noticeable, measurable difference in opting for something like the A73, in this case, over the A33 or A53. I also just want to quickly mention that when it comes to app management, namely with the RAM, while there is sometimes a difference between 6 and 8 gigs, in this case, with my tests, I didn't really find, like the A73 for example, to be keeping many more apps open, current, and running in the background over the other two phones. I think if we were comparing 4 and 8 gigs of RAM, yeah, that would lead to more apps staying open and ready for you to jump back into. But between 6 and 8 gigs nowadays, I just don't really see that mattering too much, at least not enough to be a deciding factor here. And all three of these phones can be spec'd to have 6 or 8 gigs of RAM anyway, and you can utilize that RAM Plus tool in settings to gain a bit more virtual memory for free if that's important to you. So RAM, at least with these three phones, not really a factor in most cases. Also, if you're curious, over the course of about 2 hours or so of testing, all three phones lost about the same battery percentage, but you can see that the A33 and A53 have similar estimates with their time remaining, while the A73 has a bit worse battery life estimate. Now, I'll do a full battery drain and recharge test in a separate video, but I sort of thought that was interesting, and it likely suggests that the faster, more powerful processor in that phone, which again is the only difference in spec in the lineup, might be drawing a bit more power in comparison to the other two devices. So all in all, if you're deciding between these three phones in particular, I think you're going to have to look beyond the performance and specs between the A33 and A53. In my opinion, there's no difference or advantage there, and there obviously shouldn't be. The internals are supposed to be the same. If you're eyeing the A73, yes, you will get a performance boost, generally across the board, but figure out if that performance boost will matter based on your usage. If gaming is your thing and you want to play at max settings, but maybe don't want to pay $1,000 for a flagship phone, then it totally makes sense to opt for the A70 III. But if you're more of a casual user with your apps and things, I can't really see this phone being worth the extra cash, again, if performance and specs are what you're looking at. Obviously, like I said, there are other factors and features on these three phones that might sway your decision one way or another. But what do you guys think? Was there anything about this speed test that surprised you? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.